Okay, so this is number 21 in the packet, and given the polar equation, determine the conic section and convert to general form. So the first step you want to do is you want to make this 3, you want to get that to a 1. So in order to do that, you're going to divide by 3 in the numerator and denominator. And it's okay to have fractions, do not worry. Alright, so after you get this new equation, we're just going to use some information in this to write a little tidbit of information off to the side that's going to help us later in life. So if you look at this number right here, 2/3, that's our eccentricity. I'm just going to write that. And if you divide 2 by 3, it's less than 1. So that makes it an ellipse. Make sure here you use this number and not this number. This is not the eccentricity, this is the eccentricity. It's always on the bottom. And if we look at this right here, sine, that tells us that our ellipse is going to be vertical. Alright, so just keep that in mind. That'll help us later in life. But the next step we're going to do, and I'm going to show you this visually, is we're going to plug in some numbers back into the original equation. So if you look at the unit circle, and the unit circle is a circle on a graph, the only 2 points that hit the y-axis are pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. And we're going to use these points because this equation is vertical since it's sine, and we're going to plug in pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2 back into the original equation. So let's do 3 pi over 2 first. And keep in mind, don't plug it into this equation, we're plugging it into this equation. That's a mistake you could possibly make. So r equals 20 over 3 minus 2 sine 3 pi over 2. And if you remember back to your unit circle, you know that sine 3 pi over 2 is -1. So now you're just going to go ahead and simplify. So 20 over 3 minus 2 times -1 equals 20 over 5, which simplifies to 4. So just keep that number in mind real quick. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to plug in pi over 2 back into the original equation, just like we did here. So r equals 20 over 3 minus 2 sine pi over 2. And once again, if you remember back to your unit circle, you know that sine pi over 2 is just +1. So keep simplifying. We know that's 20 over 1, and that equals 20. So after you get these two numbers, these are relevant because they're going to help you form your polar vertices. Now, in order to form your polar vertices, you're going to take this number and this number and just write them in a parenthesis. Just like you would a polar coordinate, you're going to put them together. And make sure when you write these, you write the radian before the number, not the number before the radian. That's a mistake you can make because these are polar vertices. If you were to graph these, they would be graphed on a polar graph, which leads me into my next step. The next step is converting these into rectangular vertices. And just a way that helps me think about it is if we were to graph these on a polar graph, we know that 3 pi over 2 goes in a downward direction. And if you went out 4 on a polar graph and then went down 3 pi 2, your 4 would be negative. So in order to write that, you would write 0, -4. And same thing for pi over 2. If you were to go out 20 and go up pi over 2, since pi over 2 is going in an upward direction, it makes 20 positive. So it would be 0, 20. So after that, we can find our center. These are our rectangular vertices. And we can find our center using our rectangular vertices. And all you have to do for that is average them together. So we know that 20 minus 4 equals 16, and 16 divided by 2 equals 8. And we also know that the average of 0 and 0 is just 0. So because of this, our center is 0, 8. After we find our center, we can find A. Now, A is just the distance from your vertices to the center. I'm going to make a little note of that. A is distance from vertices to center. And let's look at 8 and 20. Let's just keep numbers positive. It helps things, make them a little easier. So from 8 to 20 is 12, and also from 8 to -4 is 12. So A equals 12. All right, so after we find A, the next thing we need to find is C. And remember our equation for eccentricity, E equals C over A? That's how we're going to find C. So if we look at our tidbit of information up here, this is where that comes into play now. We know our eccentricity is 2/3. E equals C over A. So we're going to plug in E because we know what the eccentricity is, and we're going to plug in A, and then we're going to solve for C. So E is 2/3. We don't know C, and A is 12. So now we're just going to solve that and cross multiply. So 12 times 2 is 24, and 3 times C is 3C. Divide by 3, and C equals 8. So after we find C, the last number that we need to find in order to write our ellipse is B. And we can find that by plugging C and A into the equation A squared minus B squared equals C squared. Now, a mistake you might make here is you might use A squared plus B squared. You always want to use A squared minus B squared because that's the equation you use for an ellipse. The A squared plus B squared would be used for a hyperbola. So A is 12, so 12 squared is 144, minus B squared equals, C is 8, so 8 squared is 64. Now, in order to keep B positive, the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 64 from both sides. Now I'm going to add B squared to this side. So when you add b to this side, you find that 80 equals b squared. And now we have everything to write our ellipse. So since we know that it's vertical, or let's start with the center. So our center is 0, 8. Oops. So x plus 0, which is just x, plus y minus 8, because if you remember back to when we were doing this, when you plug in your center, it always has to be opposite. That's another thing you could mess up on. Make sure that when you plug in your center, I know you can't have negative 0, so you just write x squared, but you do have negative 8, so you have to write y minus 8. And since this is vertical, our a is going to go under our y, and once again, a squared is 144, and our b is going to go under our x, and b squared is 80, just like we found down here. And conics always equal 1. So this is your conic section, I guess you could say. So the next thing, just go grab a new sheet of paper. Alright, so our next step, we're not done yet. Now we have to go to general form. In order to do this, the first thing we have to do is find the least common multiple of 80 and 144. So we know that, and in order to do this without a calculator, because this is a non-calculator question, we know that 16 times 5 equals 80, and also 16 times 9 equals 144. And see how the 16 repeat here? You're just not going to use one of the 16s, and you're going to multiply 16 times 9 times 5. And that gives you a least common multiple of 720. So since your least common multiple is 720, you're just going to multiply this whole equation by the least common multiple. So what you do is, well, this is what I like to do. I like to imagine that there's ones, imaginary ones. And if it helps to write you, then go right ahead. It's not going to change anything. So you do 720 times 1, which is still 720, divided by 80, and you get 9. And then you're going to write the x squared. And then 7, and then you do the same for this part. So 720 times 1 is 720, divided by 144, which is 5. And then you also write this part that comes with it. That's another mistake you might make. Make sure you don't leave the x parentheses squared and the y minus 8 parentheses squared. You want to include those because those are going to help you solve. So after you find this, you're just going to set it equal to your least common multiple, 720. And most of you might think, oh, the next step is to distribute the 5. But since this squared is here, nope, that's wrong. You're going to either FOIL or box this y minus 8 squared. And I like to box, so I'm just going to box this on the side. So y times y is y squared. Y times negative 8 is negative 8y. Negative 8 times y is negative 8y. And negative 8 times negative 8 is 64. So when you put that all together, you get y squared minus 16y plus 64. So now we're going to take this and put it back into our parentheses. And it still equals 720. So now what we can do is now we can distribute the 5 to everything in these parentheses. So you should get 9x squared plus 5y squared minus 80y plus 320 equals 720. See what I did there? I just distributed the 5 to everything in the parentheses. And now, my last step is this side has to equal 0. So, I'm going to subtract 720 from both sides. And always remember that you have to subtract like terms. So, 320 minus 720 is negative 400. And then we're just going to fill the rest in. Alright, and that's it. That is how you go to general form. And one last thing is sometimes the number or the letters don't always go in numerical order. Numerical. Okay, these are, my bad. These are letters. So make sure, we want these to be in alphabetical order. So if they weren't in alphabetical order, just make sure you put them in that way.